Hello, and welcome to this RPTH research recap, where we dive a little deeper into the science being published at RPTH. My name is Erik Lok. I work in Leiden, the Netherlands, as an internist, and I'm a member of the editorial board of RPTH. I'm extremely pleased to introduce Dr. Julie Partridge. She is a professor of sport and exercise psychology in the School of Human Sciences at Southern Illinois University Carbondale and holds cross appointments in the SIU School of Medicine and the School of Psychological Behavioral Sciences. Her research explores motivation, social influences, and self consciousness emotions in sport and physical activity. And as she survived pulmonary embolism herself in 2019, her area of research widened to the post-clot recovery process. Dr. Partridge recently published a paper in RPTH entitled Exercise Social Support, Barriers and Introduction in Venous Thromboembolism Survivors. This is a unique study as it touches upon two key components of PE aftercare that do not receive sufficient attention in current VTE clinic and research. These are providing adequate information to patients, as well as optimal counseling of patients with regard to physical exercise following a VTE diagnosis. For those of you joining us live on Facebook, X, and YouTube, please leave your comments below, which will be answered during the discussion. Now, Julie, we look truly forward to hearing your presentation.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the introduction and the opportunity to talk about this today. As you mentioned, I am a PE survivor myself, so this is a really personally meaningful study. And I want to also make sure that I say a thank you to my co-authors, Phil Anton, Julianne Wallace, and Leslie Lake. There may be a little bit of, some of the wording may be a little bit different when we uploaded it, but we will definitely work through it. So one of the most prescribed treatment and recovery practices following VTE, of course, is to encourage people to exercise. There's been a wide variety of modalities that have been looked at, including things with home-based interventions, aquatic-based therapy, respiratory therapy, and these have really generally been found to be safe and effective. And also beneficial for for allowing people to avoid having more clots. But currently there have been almost no formalized or systematically assessed guidelines to help transition people into physical activity. Certainly not like what you see in cardiac or pulmonary rehab, and very few people with clots seem to qualify for those rehab programs. And so people tend to get into situations where they're getting maybe inconsistent or confusing instructions. They're not maybe sure what to do. And so one of the things that we know about exercise in general is that when people aren't sure how to engage in it, it can lower adherence. In addition to that, a lot of the outcome measures for studies with exercise and VTE have focused understandably on the physical components. So things like, improvements to VO2 output, thrombus progression. And then there have also been several that have looked at quality of life issues. But I think one of the things that we're starting to understand is that there is a lack of research on the overall psychosocial considerations that we have to navigate as survivors, including things like just generally what motivates us, or there's certain motivational principles that we need to be adhering to. What are the barriers that we do experience? What kind of social support exists? And what type of social support is provided? So not only the mechanisms that provide it, but what does it look like? And then what messaging do we receive about it? Is it consistent? Is it confusing? Do people understand what they're being asked to do? So the research questions for this study really address that. And again, this is really a descriptive study because we wanted to try to find out where people were at to start. And so we looked at the main sources of social support. Again, not necessarily what types of social support were utilized in this part of the study, but just who is providing it for you. What are the most significant barriers that exist? Are those physical, social, psychological, or something else? And then what specific information relative to exercise was provided by medical staff following your diagnosis? So our study was cross-sectional and it was qualitative. So we are taking a snapshot here. We recruited participants from social media-based VTE survivor groups, such as Team Stop the Clot, which is one that's focused a bit more on exercise. People could take the link to take the questionnaires, but then they were also allowed to share it. So we attempted to kind of cast a little bit of a wider net. We did have some demographic information, but that was just to kind of understand what our sample was like. Because this was qualitative, it was not intended really to compare any groups within the sample. But we had open-ended questionnaires about, following your diagnosis, who provided you with support for exercise, gave a couple of examples of what that might look like. So do you have somebody to watch your kids? Is there somebody exercising with you? Since your diagnosis, what have been your biggest barriers? And then what were you told about exercise by your medical provider after your diagnosis? So our data analysis, again, it was qualitative. So we used inductive content analysis. So we all examined the data separately, looked for pieces that fit together into higher order themes or categories where there was overlap, and then reached consensus validation for these categories. It sort of strangely turned out that we had 6 sort of higher order themes under each question, which I'll talk about here in a moment. So our sample, what it looked like, we had, a little under 500 people who took it. 63% had had a DVT, 71% had had a PE, and then we had another 11.7% that had had another type of clot. I will point out that, 61% basically self-reported that they were regularly exercising. We used a trans-theoretical model sort of definition, so planned physical activity, performed to increase physical fitness 3 to 5 times a week for at least 20 to 60 minutes each session. That is a relatively high number for self-reported exercise, but considering where we sampled from, probably not super surprising, but just want to point that out. It is a relatively higher level of exercise, people exercising in this sample. We did ask people how long since they'd been diagnosed. This one was kind of a funny little bimodal response, where we had about a third of people who were less than 6 months out, about a third that were 1 to 5 years out, and then the other third fit into these other categories. I'm not really clear on why exactly, it turned out like that, but, we had kind of a variety there. The age for our categories was pretty normally distributed. So we had about a third in the 45 to 54 age range, but we did have, less than 3%-ish in both 18 to 24 and then over 75. Now here's where our sample starts to look definitely a little less diverse. So we had, about 87.8% of the sample identified as female. So it was a very heavily skewed female sample, and also very heavily skewed on the race side. 90% were white. So this was a pretty middle-aged white woman sample for sure. So we do want to keep that in mind when looking at the results. I'm going to go through the sources of social support really quickly, because these were, again, just sort of the sources that we saw. So, family made up, over half. Now, these percentages don't add up to 100 because people could list as many as they wanted. But over half of the people said their family was supporting them. And that, of course, is, spouse, partner, kids, dogs, parents, siblings, anybody within a family structure was in that category. Friends, again, about 1 in 4 people. These were individuals who were specifically not mentioned as being part of an exercise class or group. It got cut off a little at the top there. But these were like, oh, I go for a walk with my neighbor. But they were not specifically seen as exercise-related friends. I would say it's probably unfortunate that almost 1 in 4 said there was nobody who provided support. Some people just said, hey, I rely on myself. So I don't know that that's necessarily a bad thing. But generally in exercise, we see social support as being a benefit. And so to have almost 1 in 4 say there's nobody that provides support for me is probably not great. Then, any member of the medical or allied health community, so doctors, nurses, exercise physiologists, PT, OT, that was another 18%. Individuals that were in a part of an exercise class or group, or like a personal trainer, those individuals were included here because they were identified primarily through their exercise relationship to the person. And then I think somewhat surprising, only about 10% of people said that blood clot specific support groups actually provided this for them. And I think this is an area that we probably want to look at a little bit closer as to why that number was that low. So yeah, anything on social media that was specifically dedicated to VTE. So a little bit more about the barriers. I think that's a bit more, and then the medical information provided. I don't think this would come as a surprise to anybody. Again, these add up to more than 100% because people could list as many as they wanted. But yeah, almost 90% of people said, look, physically, there are issues that prevent me from wanting to exercise or have impacted my exercise. So whether that is fatigue, a comorbidity, shortness of breath, pain, increased heart rate, or uncomfortable feeling in heart, whatever, those were almost 90% of people. And then it drops down to this emotional component, but I will mention, I'm going to show a couple of quotes that I think illustrate that these two are very closely linked. So the emotional piece was like feelings of anxiety or depression, body image, self-presentation. So that includes things like, I didn't want to wear compression socks because it's embarrassing at the gym to have on the compression socks. I don't want people to ask about it. But it also was feelings of anxiety related to the physical sensations. Anticoagulation concerns are in here as well as a separate component. So I'm afraid of falling or bleeding or being alone when I'm exercising because I don't want to have an accident and have a bleeding incident. The social piece was pretty small, but again, this is like, I don't have the information maybe, or nobody to watch my kids if I go to exercise. So a lack of social support is a concern. Fortunately, there were about 7%, almost 8% who said, I don't really have any barriers. So that's wonderful. And I just very briefly want to mention here, this other category is relevant because this was where people mentioned like, I don't like to go when it's too hot, not because of swelling, but just, I don't like to exercise in the heat. But most importantly, time was in here. If you look at almost any other study that looks at barriers to physical activity, time is number one for people. They don't have time to do it. That does not seem to be an issue with this, sample that we had. They understood the importance of doing it and the recognition of, no, I could make time for it, but there are these other issues that are actually more pressing that are preventing me from being able to engage in it. I'm going to give, again, just a couple of quotes here. The physical stuff, it's exactly what you would think. If I feel like I'm going to collapse every time I exert myself, then of course that's a barrier to me wanting to engage in that activity. But I think this quote that I highlighted with the emotional piece really drives it home. So being afraid to do something because of a sore muscle giving me anxiety is not the same thing as my muscle hurts too bad to do this. That's a physical issue. Saying every time I have a sore muscle, that twinge makes me think I have a clot. That is an emotional piece, but I do think that they're linked together and it's difficult to separate them out at times. The anticoagulation concerns, again, it's what you would expect. I don't want to be alone on my bike. I don't want to crash on my bike because I'm on blood thinners. And then the social piece, again, it was everything from I don't have childcare to nobody was telling me what max heart rate was okay. And so even when I'm asking, I don't have that information. And again, it is linked to the anxiety, I'm afraid. Again, no barriers or I don't have time to do it. Pretty straightforward overall. Last component that we had was the information about exercise from medical providers. These do add up to 100% because there was basically one answer that they were giving. So nothing got above, nothing got to a third of the responses, but we had this interesting sort of, I got some positive information about physical activity in terms of I should do it, but I wasn't given specific instructions or guardrails that I think would help people lessen their anxiety about how to do it. So it was positive, but not super specific. I think it's kind of unfortunate that almost 1 in 4 said I was given no information about initiating or returning to physical activity. So, almost 1 in 4 saying that is maybe a little bit of an area where we could see some improvement. This interceptive focus, again, I'll highlight it with a quote in a minute, but this was information that was given that was really centered on focus on what your body feels like. So listen to your body, do what's comfortable for you. And I will say that this was not a very popular piece of information that our respondents talked about. But in any case, being cautioned or contraindicated, like you shouldn't be doing this for a specific reason. So that's another almost 14%. Then there was this other group that was positive, but they were given more specific instructions or a referral to somebody that could help them with the exercise process instead of sort of being left on their own. So overall, it was, about half of the sample said, yes, I was told exercise is good for me, but there was maybe a difference in how it was messaged, right? And then another, about 5% had this sort of confusing or conflicting information. So, differences between providers, or they were told one thing and then it was changed to something, or, two people giving different info. So again, the non-specific, again, people were sort of responding to it like, I was told to go back to what I could do, but it was vague and I didn't really understand what that meant. There was no, again, like almost a guardrail to kind of help with the feelings of, am I okay to do this really? Again, I wish I knew more of what and how much is allowed. If I'm not given that information, it feels very much like I'm uncertain if this is okay to do. The interceptive focus, again, it wasn't a huge percentage, but it was not a popular response. So, to exercise but not overdo it, it's like the worst worded advice I ever got. And when I ask how much is too much, it's just don't overdo it. And I think this last one hits the nail on the head for people who have maybe been exercising before, that it's hard to listen, quote unquote, listen to your body, because it's really difficult to measure that scale when you're used to pushing yourself. And the line is very different now than it was before your diagnosis. Positive and specific would be like, okay, don't lift more than 10 pounds, don't do inclines or hills, or here's a specific program you can follow that gave people a little bit more confidence in understanding what they were allowed to do. And then of course, caution or contraindicated, like don't do more than you need to do right now. Don't go crazy with new exercise, or like you shouldn't be doing this maybe right now. And then unfortunately some conflicting, it wasn't a huge amount, but just one person said, I would never run again, just light aerobic activity. And another person said, you can run as much as you want. So getting that information, that's difficult to manage in your head. So, overall, yes, survivors have a lot of sources of social support to draw from. Family is the biggest source. That's consistent with previous research, what we would probably expect. The barriers, I think, are really centered on both the physical and the psychological component of the diagnosis. Messaging focused on interoceptive sensations. I think there's more that needs to be done here. It's unclear if this population benefits from close monitoring of body signals in the same way. And having been a survivor, I will say, like, you're monitoring your body a lot. And so to listen to your body, it's like, yes, that I am listening, but I'm not sure what it's telling me necessarily all the time. And then exercise messages, reported by survivors, it covers a really wide variety of information. And I think there's a lot of great connections to what we see as barriers, like fear of exertion, that it's good to be exercising, but maybe helping, there may be ways that we can understand that messaging a little bit better in terms of what it means for us when we start to exert ourselves and how we feel. Now, obviously, this is a very, very homogeneous sample. It's not a very diverse sample, so we have to certainly see that as a limitation. It is also cross-sectional, so we weren't looking at determining how those perceptions change over time, which I think is a really important concept to be considering. And then the qualitative nature of it just limits our ability to compare, within this sample, like looking at any differences between some of those demographic characteristics. So I think there's a lot of great places we can go from here. I think we want to think about what leads to not only being physically ready. In injury psychology, we talk a lot about return to play, so somebody can be physically released to play, but psychologically, are they ready to engage again? I think it's kind of the same thing. What makes somebody psychologically ready to return? How do the perceptions of barriers and support, do those change across time following our diagnosis? Certainly, we need more diverse samples to understand better what everybody's experience is. And then what is the type of physical activity messaging that's most effective with survivors? Are we looking for people to say, hey, these are all of the benefits that are going to happen if you exercise? That's a really positive based message approach. But there is physical activity and public health messaging that focuses on the negative. Like, these are some of the things that could happen if you don't engage in it. So I think understanding the messaging a little better is certainly another area that we can examine. So I'm more than happy to take questions, discussion, all of that good stuff. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Julie, for this very insightful presentation. Clearly, this is a very important study. I have a few questions for you. And the first one is that you highlighted some selection bias in your study. And I realized that more than 90% of the study patients were white and
Hmm.
mostly women.
Hmm.
Do you think that health disparities are relevant for the topic at hand?
Yes, I definitely do. I think that it gives us maybe a place to start from, or say like this was something that we found with this very white middle-aged female sample. But I think that it would be difficult for me to imagine that there would not be some uh, differences in how people are presented this information, or who is given the information about exercise, that it would probably look different across different populations, for sure. Yes.
And from your own experience, are
Mhm.
you aware of studies that help physicians to um, make sure they give the right advices and they take the right action in patients with different backgrounds?
I think there are some out there, not necessary. I'm not as familiar with any that are, or certainly not a lot of them with VTE. But I think that there is a lot of, again, like public health messaging that we could take some information from to look at what, because I think sometimes there's a belief that, oh, if you talk about the benefits of this, it's going to make people more likely to want to do it. Um, and it's kind of funny when you look at people's physical activity and exercise behaviors, what does and does not work. And so I think we need to understand better. It may be that for individuals who again have just had a very serious health diagnosis, that talking about, hey, if you don't get back into being physically active, these are some of the things that can happen, might actually make a bigger connection for people. So I do think that a lot of the just physical activity messaging research or literature is something that can be looked at, but I don't think that there is a lot out there right now that has focused on how to have these conversations. And I think that, again, it wasn't a huge percentage of people that said that they were being told like to focus on the sensations of, just listen to your body. But people did not have great experiences with it. And so I think thinking about what is the message that we're trying to get across to people, because I think I know what it means, but I think the reality of living in a body where you're paying attention to every single twinge, to every single thing that your body does after an event like this, is really difficult to not really have that be an intense and not always very helpful experience, for sure.
Just before I go to one of the questions of the viewers,
Mhm.
so focusing on this topic, what do you think is necessary that uh, motivates physicians or healthcare providers treating VTE patients
Mhm.
to do a better job?
Mhm.
Because, and this is unfortunately how usually things go, if it's not in the guidelines,
Mhm.
people don't know it.
Right.
And if there is no evidence,
Mhm.
will never reach the guidelines. So what's necessary to improve this?
So I think this is going to sound maybe very very pie in the sky, but I do think just having a conversation about it to start with is important. I think recognizing the experience that the person is having um, is very important from a holistic standpoint. What I mean by that is, so I'm speaking only for myself now. This wasn't something that really came out in this study, but of course, after my PE, I was placed on anticoagulants, and so for the first couple of weeks, I was never sure what was possibly a side effect of the anticoagulant, what was me recovering from the PE, what was something to be concerned about. And I think even having that discussion of a little bit more information about, okay, these are the things that we're looking for. Now, I would have loved to have had, I was certainly one of those people that wanted to have a certain heart rate. That's what I wanted somebody to tell me. But even knowing that, I think even encouraging people to do some of the things that we know can be beneficial, like journaling some things. So like I realized about a month in that Mondays were really difficult for me. And that was because it's my longest teaching day. And I think I just would get exhausted. But for some reason, it wasn't until I started writing things down that I realized, why am I always in such a bad, like, why am I always so fatigued on Mondays? And so encouraging people to keep track of those things. And also, you know, if they aren't going to qualify for insurance to put them in like cardiac rehab or pulmonary rehab or anything like that, are there other options? You know, I asked for a referral to a PT. I asked for what my doctors thought would be useful, but I know not everybody is necessarily going to do that. So having some options that people can say, like, I'm not going to be able to put you into a rehab program, but these might be options. Talking about setting goals, keeping track of your, improvements. Some of those are, I think, ways to get started, because you're right, until there's data, it's hard. You can't have, set instructions or guidelines. And so what do we do before then? But I think understanding the fears and concerns, again, that it of course is the physical piece, but there's also that psychological piece of, it's not just that my heart rate is going up, but is that okay? Is it okay for that to happen? And acknowledgement of those fears as being legitimate and, real.
Clearly. Thank you. So, very short question at the end of this research recap of I think, a colleague, a PE survivor. What kind of exercise, Julie, do you enjoy doing?
Yeah, so I do like to walk. I'm a big walk and hike kind of a person. I will say though that one of the things that I found so I went to PT. I don't think they had any idea really what to do with me, so they put me in the therapy pool for a while, and we were doing pool therapy. And I realized that I really, really liked that a lot. And so I started doing deep water or water aerobics. And then I realized I actually just want to swim. So I started swimming after my PE, and that has been like a really, really helpful thing that I have found that I really, really enjoy. And it's great exercise. And I knew how to swim, but I never in a million years thought I would be a swim for exercise kind of person. But that was one good thing that has come out of that. So yes, and it's non-contact, so I don't have to worry about anything like that.
Thank you very much, Julie, for presenting your work and giving us more insight into the optimal communication on post-PE recovery, and as well as your own experiences. We hope viewers will read the full detail of your paper on our website. And Julie, please consider RPTH for your future studies.
Yes.
Thank you for those joining us live. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook, X, and YouTube. Thank you for watching, and keep an eye out for the next RPTH recap.